endings, losses, grief, death. These are very much a part of our lives. It is a part of our reality. Every one of us at one point have or will be or is experiencing loss and grief. And yet so many of us have not learned or even understood how we should live out these realities. How can we deal with the reality of loss or death in a way that is healthy, both spiritually and emotionally? How do we, as Christians, understand and live out our grief and loss in the light of the gospel? Everyone knows the story of Job and the terrible tragedy he suffered. We wonder, how could anyone survive such catastrophic experience with their faith intact? Most of us would say, I could never survive that kind of a loss. But in a sense, what Job experienced, albeit in a very short period of time, is something that we all will experience. There's a quote I put in your reflection box at the bottom of your bulletin. It's by Peter Scazzero in his book, Emotionally Healthy Church. And he writes this: our culture routinely interprets losses as alien invasions that interrupt our normal lives. Jonathan Edwards, in a famous sermon on the book of Job, noted that the story of Job is the story of us all. Job lost everything in one day: his family, his wealth, his health. Most of us experience our losses more slowly over the span of a lifetime until we find ourselves at the door of death, leaving everything behind, all our relationships, all our possession, and all our health. That's our reality. We lose our dreams. We lose our youthfulness. We experience loss and grief when we lose our routine, especially in times of transition, such as changing or losing a job, or when we lose our independence, or when we become caretakers of our parents. During times like this, we experience grief and loss. And of course, there are the experiences of devastating loss, like when a family member dies all unexpectedly, a friend commits suicide, a spouse has an affair, a loyal friend betrays you, you're single again after a painful divorce, you're diagnosed with cancer, and we can go on and on and on, adding to the list. Loss is inevitable. So how can we handle grief and loss? How do we live out the resurrection power of the gospel? First, let's look at the ways we do deal with loss and grief. One way we deal with it is denial. We deny how we're truly feeling. I'm fine, thank you. Another way is minimization. We admit something is wrong, but it's not as serious as it really is. For example, my son is okay. He only drinks sometimes, when in fact he drinks all the time and is never home. Thirdly, we blame someone or ourselves. It's my fault that my mom's not taking care of me and drinking all the time. I'm not good enough. Fourthly, we rationalize. We say things like, oh, it's not that bad compared to how others are suffering in the world. I don't have anything to cry about. And lastly, we deal with loss and grief by becoming hostile. We say things like, don't talk about Fred. There's nothing that's going to bring him back. Those are some of the ways we deal with grief and loss. But as the people of the gospel, as Christians, how are we supposed to deal with it? How did Jesus deal with grief and loss? This morning, we're going to try and answer that question by looking at this famous story of Lazarus and his sisters Martha and Mary. This is the last of our series on crucial encounters with Christ. And this morning, we're going to look at how Martha and Mary's encounter with Jesus transformed them in their grief. Mary and Martha, sitting beside their brother who's sick and dying, sends word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Isn't it interesting to note that the word love is used twice here very quickly in verse 3 and then verse 5? This tells us that Jesus had a special relationship with Lazarus and his sisters. This word love is usually used in conjunction with Jesus' inner circle of disciples, Peter, James, and John. And so when we see it used twice here, we conclude that Jesus loved Lazarus and Martha and Mary in a very special way. There is no question of his love for them. And though they were specially loved, they were not spared the tragic grief of losing their brother through illness. So often when we, believers of a loving and gracious God, come face to face with our losses and great tragedies, we question God's love. Doesn't God love me? Doesn't God care? We question whether God really loves us. And just as we question God, so does Martha and Mary. Both Martha and Mary asks the same questions as we read in verse 21 and 32. They both ask, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus says before the question is even asked, he said this, the sickness will not end in death. Rather, it's for God's glory so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Jesus doesn't say this to the sisters. He doesn't say to them, I know you're hurting, but God's going to be glorified through this. When he said this, he was saying it to his disciples. So how does Jesus answer Martha and Mary? Jesus responds differently to Mary and to Martha. With Martha, Jesus lovingly confronts her. He tells her that he is the resurrection and the life. And with Mary, Jesus says nothing. Instead, he just weeps. Same situation, same brother, even the same question, but Jesus responds differently. When the sisters ask, Lord, why weren't you here? You could have stopped this. They're asking a major faith question. And with Martha, Jesus confronts her. He speaks to her the truth. He tells her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live. Jesus teaches Martha the truth of who he is, but with Mary, he doesn't even answer. He just weeps, and all he could do is ask, where have you laid him? Jesus is truly God, and he is truly man. He's not just flesh, and he's not just deity. He is God in the flesh. And our God is the only God who humbled himself to become a human being. And because he was born and raised and lived, Jesus has experienced all that humanity experiences. It says in Hebrews 4:15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet was without sin. Jesus was fully human, and when he is faced with grief and loss, he wept. He entered into Mary's grief and wept. Some people have trouble coming to grips with the full humanity of Christ. They can't seem to relate to how patient he is, how sympathetic he is to broken people, with hurting people, with sinful people. They can't seem to grasp Jesus' full humanity, but Jesus does. He meets us in our grief by entering in with us. He sympathizes with us. We don't have to pretend that we're okay. We don't have to rationalize our feelings. We can weep. We can be honest with our feelings. We can express our emotions and know that we're not alone, but have the one who is able to sympathize with us. Verse 33 says, when Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. When we read this, we can understand why Jesus was feeling disturbed and moved. He sees Mary's grief and all that's following Mary, all wailing and grieving. So we understand why Jesus is feeling the way he is. But when you reread this passage over and over again, Jesus' reaction is actually a little puzzling. It doesn't seem to make sense, and here's why. First, when Jesus enters the scene, he knows why Lazarus died. Remember, Jesus said earlier, so that God be glorified. Jesus knows why Lazarus died. And secondly, the second thing that makes Jesus' reaction surprising is that he knows what's going to happen. He knows he's going to turn this funeral into a party. He knows that in 10 minutes, everyone will be rejoicing because he will raise Lazarus from the dead. So why doesn't Jesus just come in and say, wait till you see what I've got in store? If you knew you were about to turn everything around, would you be troubled and deeply moved? Would you enter into Mary's grief? Why would Jesus do that? Jesus wept because he is perfect. Jesus will not close his heart, not even for 10 minutes. He will never refuse to enter in. He doesn't say, there's not much point in entering into all this grief. He goes in. He is not aloof or distant. He is there with us.